Dear friends, good evening and welcome to the first session of our 2021 People of Interest series. 2021, here we come. We have curated and collected some incredibly inspiring and fascinating individuals from across the spectrum of human interest stories, philosophy, psychology, inspiration, and well-being. As in the past, we are, of course, delighted to collaborate with the Jewish Chronicle, as well as with my esteemed colleagues in their Chabad centers and communities across the country, including Chabad in the city of Manchester, Chabad of Hampstead Garden Suburb, Chabad of Solihull, Chabad Lubavitch Liverpool, Chabad of Golders Green, Chabad of Bournemouth, Chabad Mill Hill East, Chabad Finchley, Chabad of Liverpool Universities, Chabad of Nottingham. Tonight, we will be hearing the painful yet inspiring story of Rabbi Avremi Zippel, who will share his story of overcoming years of sexual abuse and the powerful insights that he learned, discovered, and has come to teach and share from his life's journey. Rabbi Zippel is an advocate for survivors of sexual abuse and is the program director and spiritual leader at Chabad of Utah, together with his wife, Shana, and their children. Rabbi Zippel, some of you may know, was also an intern at Chabad Belgravia during our early formative days, and is someone who impressed me very deeply at the time, and much more so over time, as I became aware of the terrifying challenges he had experienced as a child, and has worked so diligently to overcome in his adulthood, transforming pain into purpose. Friends, at this point, I'm going to draw your attention to a short video clip to introduce tonight's conversation with Rabbi Zippel. Olivia, I'm going to ask you if you don't mind sharing, because I don't seem to be able to. Here we go.
Rabbi, if you just go onto the YouTube page once you share the screen,
Okay.
it should work for you. So now if you press play, just on the YouTube page, yeah, if you press play, yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, and the sound is coming through?
No, can you hear it?
I can. Let me just... Okay, let me know.
No, I can't hear the sound. It should be coming through. Rabbi, if you just unmute yourself, we might be able to hear it.
Perfect.
And then if you go onto the video and press play.
How's that?
Yeah, now we can hear it.
My name is Avremi Zippel. I'm a rabbi here in Salt Lake City, Utah. I am 28 years old, and I was sexually abused by my nanny for a decade. I realize that it never gets easier. The words "I was sexually abused as a child" never roll off your tongue. If I'm going to acknowledge that something terrible has been done to me, which I was not party to, which I was not complicit in, what kind of God lets that happen? was raised in a sheltered household. We were the household that we didn't watch movies if there was a kissing scene. That was kind of our exposure to the outside world, and I don't look back on that disparagingly. It was a childhood that was dominated by the theme of service and giving to a community and caring for others and putting others' spiritual needs above one's physical needs. In the summer of 1999, my parents just moved into a new house. We moved right before my birthday. My 8th birthday party was kind of like a housewarming little gig, and my parents had just started getting regular full-time help. More than anything, I remember just confusion. I knew without a doubt that was not okay, but the confusion that resulted from that was, who's not okay? Who's wrong here? Who's guilty? I think there were too many questions for my 8-year-old mind to handle, and so I decided to take the path of less resistance, and I just decided to do nothing about it and just leave things the way they were. I assumed that my confusion and my silence, on an 8-year-old's level, gave my abuser the answer she was looking for as to, how this situation could possibly progress. And it did. I never fought. I never resisted. I never screamed. And I remember multiple times leaving the bathroom and I'd start reciting the Hebrew confessional prayer. And whilst I was doing that, I was wondering when this would happen again. I don't know how an adult can live with those, competing voices in their head. I don't know how a child lives with those competing voices in their head. What I remember quite clearly is that I was completely unaware that what had been going on was referred to as sexual abuse. In my mind, sexual abuse required a very important component, and that was that it required coercion. I was making every effort from the outside perspective to live, the best version of my life. And I was a happy kid, and I was, successful in my studies, and I still wanted to be a rabbi. And there were times that I would go to bed at night, and before I would do that, I'd look in the mirror, and I was convinced that the person that I saw in the mirror was the most despicable person in the entire world. I don't know, where do they send sinners? Whatever they do with, the worst of mankind, that's what they were going to do with me. As the years went along, I got married, which for me had been the hope that that would be healing. Here was going to be the first healthy, proper, appropriate sexual relationship in my life. Bear in mind that before I got married, I had never as much as held hands with another woman, the exception of my abuser. Getting married wasn't the magic potion. Shortly after my wife and I had our first child, I was not myself. I was, dealing with symptoms of depression and anxiety, and the stuff in my head wasn't just going away, and it wasn't just being put to bed quietly at night. It was demanding answers. In February of 2016, my parents and my wife sat me down and they said, You're not you. We think you should go and see somebody. And I was very resistant. It was, the prototypical therapist's office with the couch and the bookcase and his little thermos of coffee. And he looked at me and says, so what brings you here today? And he was the first human being that I ever said the words to. And I looked up at him and I said, I think I was sexually abused by my nanny. In the months that I started seeing my therapist, I think that there was kind of this natural progression from, okay, this was wrong. This is not your fault. Not only was this not your fault, but this is actually a crime. Pursuing the criminal element of it would mean publicly acknowledging that I had been sexually abused. And that was a non-starter. That was not going to happen. In January of 2018, Larry Nassar was brought to justice, and all of his survivors testified in open court on TV, and I watched Ali Reisman's testimony. And Ali was a Jewish girl and this, world record-setting gymnast, and here she was telling the story. If a gold medal gymnast can be a survivor of sexual abuse, why can't a rabbi? On January 30th of 2018, I called the cops. And I remember walking out of the police station, and I called my wife, and I said, if I die today, I will die a happy man. She will know that this behavior did not go unnoticed. My abuser was arrested on 130 counts of sexual abuse. I didn't know what to expect on any level. And seeing, my abuser's mugshot, under this headline, 130 counts, for the first time it really set in that a crime had been done to me. I testified on Tuesday, February 5th, and later that day my story was published. I was a survivor of sexual abuse for the whole world to know. For so many different reasons, it was the most healing thing I could have ever done. When I started healing, I think for me that was probably the biggest question, is if I'm not so terrible, where does that put me with God? What I can say is that having been on this journey with everything that it has entailed, leaves not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that this journey is divinely inspired. I could not be more thankful or grateful or appreciative to God for having given me the ability to see His hand guiding me down this path.
Wow, Avremi, what a powerful intro to what promises to be a very powerful and inspiring conversation. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming to join us here, for taking the time, for expending the emotional energy that it takes to discuss and to share and to explore and to teach. I'm sure that each conversation like this has its own, in Yiddish we say Überlebenisch, has its own reliving or rehashing of sorts, the pain you once went through and continue to go through on some level. So thank you on behalf of all watching from our community and all communities tonight. Thank you, Avremi.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be with you, and thank you for hosting this, what I feel is the most important conversation. I know it takes a lot of bravery to be willing to have that conversation with one's community, and so thank you for doing that.
Absolutely. I think there can't be a more important conversation than one that brings awareness to what was relatively obscure and unknown, and therefore misunderstood underside, darker side of childhood for so many millions whose souls were literally crushed and many times worse than that due to this hell on earth experience. So let's jump into a few quick questions. The first, tell us, if you can, a few words about the childhood you had, the type of home you were raised in, and perhaps some of the background circumstances that led to your experience.
Definitely. So my parents opened Chabad here in Salt Lake City, coming up almost 29 years ago. In 1992, the Rebbe was turning 90. As a movement, Chabad wanted to gift to the Rebbe for his birthday the opening of a facility in a state that did not yet have a full-time Chabad presence. And so Utah was the state. And my parents were the lucky candidates that were shipped out to Salt Lake City. And they were kind enough to bring me along for the ride. In fact, the first Chabad event that took place here in town was my first birthday party. Kids are a great way to meet people. And like thousands and thousands of young children who grow up on the job in Chabad houses around this country and around the world, I very quickly learned that for a Chabad rabbi in Rebbetzin, the lines, if at all they exist, between a personal life and a quote professional life are very, very blurred. And being a Chabad rabbi in Rebbetzin means it's a very inclusive experience for the entire family. I was, I guess you'd say, the prototypical rabbi's kid. I'm the oldest of 6, and I was the one who was in shul every Shabbat, giving out the Siddurim and showing people the pages and being, that assistant, as it were, to my father. And I know that different children around the country and around the world take to this dynamic differently. Some go for it, some don't. I did. And from a very young age, it was a dream of mine to one day move back or move somewhere where I could, be a Chabad rabbi and be married to a Chabad rebbetzin in my own right and live a life like that for me and my family. And my wife and I were fortunate to have that opportunity. We got married in January of 2014. It's our wedding anniversary on Monday. And we moved back here later that year to kind of beef up the activities for the next generation here in Salt Lake City. But that was the life I knew. It was a different household. I was the only child that I knew in the city who walked around with a yarmulke and tzitzis. And I think the most glaring dynamic of how unique my childhood was back in the day, and even till today, and we're hoping to change the dynamic very shortly, Utah did not have any sort of Jewish educational infrastructure. There was no day school, there was no cheder, there was nowhere for someone like me to go, and so I was homeschooled. Quite literally homeschooled. I know you folks in the UK are going through a lockdown right now, and you can definitely relate to the concept of homeschooling. And so, it was me and my siblings and my parents at home all day, every day. There was no school that we went to. There were no friends that we played with. And so as a result of that, we were at home a lot. We were under my parents' skin quite a bit. And as such, when my youngest brother was born in 1998, there was kind of this impetus to bring full-time help into the house and to have another pair of hands to assist my mom. And that's ultimately where things began till where they are today.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess we're going to touch on this a little bit later on in the conversation, but I guess a question that many will have is, it goes without saying your parents had absolutely no clue what was happening. Have you ever discussed with them how they look back on what happened? How is it that these experiences went completely, under the radar? And have you ever discussed with them your experience and heard from them their feelings? And have they shared with you what it means to them to have had a son go through what you've gone through? It's a tough question, and I know
sure.
You've told me, Avremi, that you're holds barred and you're ready to take any question.
No, it's a valuable question. I think it really speaks to the dynamics at play over here. And so I didn't understand what was happening to me for almost the entirety of the time that it was going on. And one might make the argument that that's what contributed to it happening. As a result of that, I believe that my abuser is, like many, many, many predators, was very cunning, was very aware of the circumstances. And I think having this sort of environment where there was this, cultural and religious taboo around this topic definitely provided very, fertile ground for this situation to develop. Throughout my experiences and having come out as an advocate and learning more about this topic, I firmly believe that there's no such thing as a sexual predator in a vacuum. These things always thrive based on the environments that they're in, and there are always enabling forces in every situation. And I don't think there were any enabling forces. There were no people that allowed this to go on, but there was an ignorance about it. There was, a culture of silence about it. When I did disclose to my parents, having been in therapy for a short while at that point, I shared with them that given what I had learned to that point, I bore no ill will towards them. God forbid. There was no blame or no shame or no guilt. And I firmly believe that they did not do or not do anything which would have prevented this from happening. The reality is, I think we know as human beings, and particularly as Jews, that guilt is an extremely irrational emotion. And we don't only feel guilt in situations where we're limited to feel it rationally. Even in instances where we're told, don't feel guilty about this, we tend to feel guilty. And so, for everyone who's touched by an issue like this, there's a path of healing. For me, there's a path of healing. For my wife, there's a path of healing. For my parents, there's a path of healing. Undoubtedly, they do feel a sense of guilt, disappointment, letdown. I'm a parent now myself. I can't imagine how I would feel if another child on the playground, slapped my son, and let alone going through those sorts of experiences. But, it really is a path of healing for all of us to realize the wreckage that has been brought to us and how we come back from that and cope with those emotions.
Wow. And I have to say, one of the most moving scenes in the opening video was you leaving the courtroom and embracing your parents. That was really powerful. And it actually, it brings me to the next question, which is, you mentioned in the video that, in your interview, that, when you did have therapy and it became clear to you that you were, you were abused and you were a survivor, you said it was a non-starter. There was no way you were going to go public. If you can give us a little bit of background as to what held you back. I'm imagining there are a number of factors, obviously the emotional, the personal, but also maybe the communal context. I mean, it goes without saying that when someone of your, position and stature and the calling, publicizes their story, it changes the way they're perceived and maybe even relate. There's some overlap with the work they do and how going forward, they're going to be seen. So if you could share with us a little bit about what those challenges were.
I like to tell people that I was raised in a fishbowl. When you grow up, one of the token observant Jewish children in your town, and even as you grow into a young adult and move back as a rabbi yourself, I look very different than most people in Salt Lake City. And I'm accustomed to that. I'm accustomed to being, the rabbi, the Jewish guy, you live with that after a while. You develop that persona, and frankly, you get comfortable with it. You live life in a fishbowl. You do kind of get used to that phenomenon of being unusual, of being strange. And as a Chabad rabbi in a town like Salt Lake City, I would say I signed up for that. I'm comfortable with that. It's been a life experience that I knew. That being said, at that point, when I was in therapy and contemplating the idea of coming forward, I did not know a single token survivor of sexual abuse within my community. Certainly someone who spoke about it. Now, I often tell the story that in the months leading up to that decision to come forward in that February, one night I needed counsel. I needed to talk to somebody who had walked a mile in these shoes, to find out what it was like. And so I sat down in my living room and I took out my computer and I Googled male observant Jewish survivor of sexual abuse. Clearly, BuzzFeed probably made a top 10 list, and there's got to be some information here. And in short order, I realized that Google knew of nobody, and traditionally, if Google doesn't know of anybody, they've got a pretty good read on the situation. I'm sorry?
There is nobody.
There is nobody, exactly. There's no one that fits this mold. And I remember at that moment being very down, very sad. There was no one I could talk to, not a single living being alive that had my similar set of circumstances that I could talk to. At the same time, I remember being oddly empowered. And I remember at that point, I had been in therapy for about 2 years. And I remember thinking to myself, I know how much I crave human connection right now, that I could talk to somebody about this. And the reality is I'm probably not the only person out there who's been through this sort of situation. And there are probably others. Instead of my wallowing in my misery of, there's no one for me to talk to. What am I going to do? I'm so lonely. Perhaps this is the place for me to become that person for other people. Perhaps I should step into the void and be that figure for the others out there in this world who wish they had someone to talk to. And so it was a gut-wrenching decision. It was one that I put off as long as possible. And initially in dealing with the police and then with the justice system, with the district attorney's office, there was kind of this guarantee and this promise of confidentiality. And I wasn't, and I told them in so many words, I don't want to be Zippel who's sexually abused. I don't want that to be my rap. I have friends, I have family, I have a life. I'm cool. And at some point, the judicial process was shaping up that I had to testify. And when I would have to testify, all bets were off, all guarantees were off, and I would have to, embrace that. And so at that point it was, okay, let's just not embrace it. Let's run with it. Let me tell the story on my terms and step into this void and become that figure. And it was not, I had no ambition for how it would turn out. I had no clue how it would turn out. And ultimately, as you see in the video, it really was the most fortunate decision of my life. It's one that I'm grateful and thankful for every single day. And it's it's really, given me an entirely new lease on life.
You touch on something that's interesting and potentially problematic, because the more one learns and reads about sexual abuse and people who suffer from sexual abuse, and I have to actually publicly acknowledge my dear wife Hannah, who has over the years helped educate me on this topic. She's an extremely passionate advocate for all matters of injustice and those who are voiceless and marginalized, etc., especially those who are sexually abused. And the more you read about and you encounter this fear or resistance to going public, because there is a sense that it happened. I come to live with it, whatever living with it means for me, and bringing it up again and becoming known as Zippel, as you said earlier, I can't deal with that. Furthermore, when you take into account that the justice system does not have an option to remain anonymous, which itself is obviously complex, because on the one hand, if people could go ahead and make anonymous claims all the time, that would be really complicated to ascertain the truth and veracity. Conversely, how many people have not come forward because of the fear of becoming known and what that is associated with? So my question to you is, I know you also wrote about this recently in terms of defense lawyers being more sensitive and more empathetic, etc. This is a very complex issue, and I would welcome your thoughts on how you view or you think it would be wise to either to reform the system to whatever extent, or navigate those very real tensions, and oftentimes unfortunate choices between protecting the abused or the potentially wrongfully accused.
So I appreciate the opportunity. Here in the United States, we have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. We used to get along with you folks across the pond, and then we kind of struck out on our own after a while. And in such a system, we grant people who are accused of a crime the ability to confront their accuser in open court. So if you think that I did something, get up in my face and say that I did it, and allow me or my proxy, my attorney, to question you about the allegations you made. I think that's a fair system. I can't think of a more fair system. If you want to say that someone did something to you, you best be ready to say that in public and and in front of all your friends and family and their friends and family, because otherwise this would be an endless system. The reality is, I think what's woefully misunderstood is the psychological trauma that most survivors of child abuse, of sexual violence, even as adults, go through. By and large, what is so powerful about sexual violence and what is so what really brings home the idea of secondary abuse is the mentality that survivors of sexual violence of any age live with. By and large, people who were abused, raped, assaulted in any sense live with tremendous doubt, anxiety, self-loathing, and they take so much of the blame for a violent attack for which they are really due no blame on themselves. And they internalize that, and they own that, and they spend a life of misery wallowing in, why did I do it? Why was I dressed a certain way? Why did I strike up a conversation? Why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I yell louder? And so on and so forth. The reality is that the flaw in our system, which allows people accused of a crime to confront their abuser in open court, is that instead of arguing about the true or false nature of what has actually gone on, it turns into a game of dishing out blame. And so, defense attorneys, instead of saying, well, I don't believe this could have happened because, my client was out of the country or was somewhere else or was doing something else, instead it becomes this game of, but didn't you initiate the contact? Didn't you speak to my client first? Wasn't it you who ordered him a drink? Wasn't it you who allowed her into your home and you didn't say anything to your parents for so many years? And that, I believe, is an unfair question because of just the mountain of self-loathing and the mountain of emotional and psychological abuse that survivors put themselves through that is then given voice to in a courtroom. And so, yes, I believe that we should have the ability for people to, zealously defend themselves against such claims, whilst remaining sensitive to the tremendous emotional sensitivity required for people who go through these sorts of experiences.
Right, and I think that could probably be achieved through education, through lawyers who are defense lawyers and of people who are alleged to have done sexual crimes, to go through a very rigorous education of the catastrophic consequences of psychological, emotional consequences of sexual abuse. That might make them more empathetic and more sensitive in the questioning process.
Mm-hmm.
To your knowledge, is there a way for someone who was sexually abused to remain anonymous, or that's simply impossible?
I believe there's a state-by-state policy here in the United States, and I know that children can. So if a child, reports a crime, and in that sense, the complexity of the situation is multi-layered, because there are a number of agencies that are representing the child in that sense, and so there is a concept of victim one or John Doe bringing such claims. But once you reach 18, it is your word versus theirs in a certain sense, and if you want to see justice in your situation, you need to be prepared for every eventuality, and that's the nature of our situation.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. You mentioned that in the end, what made you decide to go public was the sense of how can I utilize this experience to be able to be there for others who are experience something similar. You also mentioned in the video that you were very inspired by the example of Ali Reisman. So question that immediately jumps to mind is, did you ever reach out to Ali, and did you ever thank her for being that light and for that model? And I'm curious to know how she reacted or responded, if that's the case.
So Ali actually, Ali tweeted about the story shortly after it came out, and her tweet is included in the video. Ali and I have communicated about it. We're actually hoping to do some collaborative work in the next few months. I think what Ali and I really both connect with in terms of that story is, what we both refer to as a theme of big ripples in a little sea. And so, especially in an arena like that, we really have no idea the impact of our words and our actions when expressing that sort of courage. Who's watching? I often I've shared with Ali, Ali had no idea when reading that statement that there was an Orthodox rabbi living 2,000 miles away who was watching, and who was going through the most riveting moment of his life in that instance, watching that statement be read and watching that healing process in action. And I share that with people. I share with people who feel like, I'd like to come forward, I'd like to make a difference. I don't know what sort of platform I'll have, and so I don't know if it's worth it. And I often share with people, the truth about these things has a way of just seeping through divisions, and every person that comes forward and shares their bravery and shares their story and steps into that void undoubtedly has the ability to make a powerful impact in situations that they have no idea exist. And I really, truly, and firmly believe that.
Which brings me to the next question. What type of feedback did you receive since having gone public? I can imagine you're inundated by emails or messages, and if you're comfortable, can you share maybe one or two,
Sure.
interactions?
So, I often tell the story. My article was published about 5:00 Mountain Time. I testified that morning in the preliminary hearing, and later in the day, the article was published. Obviously, it was a pretty intense 48 hours. There was a lot of contact, and I often tell people that I started that day thinking that I was the only Lubavitcher in the world that had been through what I had been through. The first 24 hours were almost inspiring. Oh, look, there's another one, and here's another family that's gone through this, and here's another situation that's gone through that. And after the first 24 hours, as it kind of morphed closer to the weekend, it went from inspiring to a little saddening to realize the rampant issue that exists within Chabad, as it does within every other community. And what I really came to understand and continue to come to understand in the years that have passed is that this is a global issue. This is not one that knows a certain community more than another. It really, it does not discriminate. It applies in every community across the board, and Chabad is no stranger, and the Orthodox community is no stranger, and the Jewish community is no stranger. Just like any other slice of society is no stranger to this issue. And it's given me an opportunity to help survivors find their voice, whether that is coming forward to one person, to their parents, to their siblings, to a spouse, to the wider public, to share that part of them. Ultimately, what I'm really thankful for is it's kind of, the scope has kind of expanded, and it's allowed people who are dealing with mental health issues across the spectrum, who are dealing with emotional issues across the spectrum, to feel recognized, to feel seen, to feel like they have a voice, which for a number of contributing factors is something which they did not feel for so long. They felt that by being challenged with these issues within the dynamics of our community, they may have been marginalized, and they very well may have been. And I think that allowing people the opportunity to feel seen and heard and recognized for who they are in that in the entirety of that truth and in the unvarnished version of that truth, giving them that opportunity is such a gift.
You know, you mentioned a little earlier about your early stages of marriage, etc. Can you share, are you comfortable sharing a little bit about what it was like to break the news to your wife? And then the bigger question relating to going public, was she supportive? Was she reluctant? Did she have reservations? And how did you navigate that together?
I often feel that the best way to answer that question is with my wife's words herself. We were having this conversation with a guest at our Shabbat table a few months ago, and we're talking about that disclosure. And in that first moment, what that was like for my wife to hear that and to be privy to that information. And my wife actually shared with this fellow sitting at our table that it would have been less surprising and more probable if I would have shared with her on that glorious day that in the 22 years of life before I knew her, I had been a very accomplished astronaut and had made multiple trips, to the moon. That would have been more believable than what I told her, because, my wife was coming from a place, as I was at the same time, where this just doesn't happen in our communities. And I know that sounds naive and I know that sounds innocent, but that was the headspace that we were in. If you are part of this community, you are somehow magically inoculated from these issues. These just don't happen here. And it rocked her world. It rocked both of our worlds. One thing that I've learned tremendously from my wife is that everyone who's affected by this issue does go through their own path of healing. And for my wife, it was, a path that she needed to realize and embrace and begin that journey of healing for herself. And, she has done a remarkable job at that and continues to do that. And we support each other as best we can, realizing that we both have these, these dual paths of finding ourselves and really realizing who we are and what we bring to the table in a relationship. And in terms of coming forward, this was something that I absolutely could not do and would not have done without my wife at my side. She's become a tremendous advocate for spouses, who are dealing with mental health issues, and she's become a tremendous assistance to so many in our community, which I know I'm very grateful for. And that really is realizing that sometimes we find ourselves in unusual situations. The person you married is not the bargain you thought you were getting, and life is really not about getting down on that, but about picking up the pieces and continuing and building on that.
You shared something absolutely fascinating and illuminating. I forgot where I heard you say it or where I read about it, but you shared that you did not see yourself as having been sexually abused, or you wouldn't consider yourself a survivor until something happened that shifted the way you viewed yourself. Are you comfortable sharing what that moment was?
Sure. And so I, like I've come to realize, like many, many, many people, not just, observant Jews, many human beings, did not realize that sexual abuse could take place in a non-coercive environment. And so, I grew up in Salt Lake City. I was a pretty worldly little boy. I read the paper every morning. I was well-versed on world issues, I guess you'd say. And I was aware that there was this concept of sexual abuse, of children being harmed in a most sensitive way. And in my mind, at that age, to fit into that criteria, as it were, there was a very important component, and that was coercion, torture, pain, resistance. Someone had to be yelling no at the top of their lungs for it to kind of qualify for that status, as it were. And short of that, it's not good, but it's not abuse. It's something else, I guess. And so, for me, the notion that a woman working in our home for a number of years, who was quite literally part of the family, for what she was doing to me to be qualified as abuse was a non-starter. It was that didn't click. Actually, the first time that I was exposed to that notion was from a TV show. I had knee surgery right before I began my internship in London, and I was watching Law and Order, and there's this episode where the detectives are communicating this idea to a troubled young person, and I'm laying there and I'm like, this is fictional, right? Like, this is a great storyline for a show, but this can't actually be real, because if that's real, what does that say about me? And I came to learn that that's very much the case. It is real. That's the reality. That's my status. That's my life. That's my story. And, the healing process follows after that.
Wow, that's very powerful. And I think that that's a nuance in your story. That's yet another layer of pulling back a certain myth or mistake people have, a mistaken perception people have about the issue, right?
It's interesting.
If somehow I wanted it on some level, what does that say about what happened? And that's, as you're saying.
Well, what's even more incredible to me is, the science shows that over 90% of childhood sexual abuse cases happen between a child and someone who is near and dear to them. And so that might be classified as a parent, teacher, religious leader, caretaker, doctor, coach, whatever it is. And certainly in my experiences, having heard from so many survivors at this point, usually it's someone they know. Usually it's someone they trust. Sexual abuse is a sickness of power, and it's a sickness of a breach of trust. And as such, those dynamics are so common and so regular because that is exactly the sort of situation that predators look for.
I have a very, tell me if you're not comfortable answering it, but did you ever confront this woman and challenge her? How dare she, or how could she have violated your trust and that precious, that childhood of yours that was essentially destroyed forever?
So I think that it's perhaps the most misunderstood part of my story. I very publicly pressed charges. I did. And my abuser is doing 25 years to life at the Utah State Prison. She was found guilty of 7 felonies. I was not out for blood. I was not out for vengeance. What I was out for was acceptance. And when the police investigation began, I made it abundantly clear to the detectives and to all those involved, all I want is, now that I've gone through therapy and I realize what's been done to me, I would like an apology. Even so much as just as an acknowledgement of what happened. Can she get up and say, "You're right, I abused you for 10 years. That's inexcusable on a very basic level, and I'm sorry." And that's something which I never got till today. I never got it. Throughout the process, once my abuser was charged with the evidence they had, the prosecutor came to me and said, was there a plea deal that you would be comfortable with? And I said, absolutely. Plead guilty to one of the counts. There were 7 felonies there. Take one count, get up in an open court in front of a judge and say, guilty as charged, Your Honor. One count. I did it one time. And there was an aversion to that. And instead it went to trial. And we are where we are today. There was a very pivotal moment for me in all of this. And that was, here, the way things are structured in our justice system is that when someone is found guilty of a crime, when it's a crime that has a victim and the victim is known to the court, there's a sentencing. And so, the person is formally sentenced in front of a judge, and the victim of that crime has an opportunity to address the court and kind of share their piece before justice is handed down. In most instances, it's an opportunity for, the victim to plead their case before the judge, please impose the harshest sentence possible. And the nature of the crimes that my abuser was found guilty for, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room. And so I wanted to use my statement, my opportunity in court for something else. And I talked a lot about my experiences, and I turned to my abuser and I said, I want you to know this is probably the last time that I'll ever see you in either of our lifetimes. And I want you to know that I forgive you. And I want to be abundantly clear, you never asked for my forgiveness. Let the record reflect that you've never asked for my forgiveness. And in fact, at that sentencing, about 10 minutes after I got off the podium, my abuser turned to the judge and said that she thought the entire thing was a joke. She thought that when she had been approached by the police, it was near April Fool's Day, and so she thought the police were playing a practical joke on her, and that's where we are. But for me, it was important to realize that much as I want that, much as I wanted that, and I continue to want that until this day, I can't live a resentful life. I can't live a life where I carry around all of that anger and intolerance and resentment towards her for what she did, because ultimately I came to realize that by doing so, I only harm me. By carrying resentment inside of me, she doesn't feel that, I feel that. I have to live with that resentment living and clanging around inside of me every day. And so, I think that my abuser knows good and well what happened. That's the path that she has taken, and one of denial and whatever it is. And I've taken what I like to consider the higher road, the road of healing and I wouldn't say moving on, because I don't know that you ever really move on from it, but the road of healing and believing in something larger than myself and continuing.
Wow, that's very powerful. The way you describe that moment, what you chose to use it for. And I think that's exceptional. It reminds me of the biblical scene with Joseph and his brothers, in a sense, where he had a moment and he was there to make a statement. And he said something similar. He said, this came from, in his instance, he was talking about the element of divine providence, which you touched on earlier, and we'll get to in a few moments. Wow. Has it changed the way you look at the world, at the people around you? Is there a part of you that's become cynical and, in a way, suspicious of everyone, of every situation? I mean, thank God you have children now. I'm assuming there are times we have to leave them with people, etc. Do you feel like a part of you will always wonder, will always question, will always second guess?
So I want to address the childcare issue in a moment, because I think it's a different discussion. But has it changed me as a person? Absolutely. Has it made me cynical and second guessing? On the contrary. The most common piece of feedback that I got when my story was published was from those that really knew me well, and I had done quite a good job of keeping this quiet, throughout the entirety of my lifetime. And
I mean, I can attest to that, in the sense that, first of all, as you said, you came to London just after you had that major discovery. When your story became public, I looked at my wife, Hannah, who you know well, and we were like, the very last person that we would ever have assumed or imagined was subject to such terrible abuse was Avremi Zippel.
Right. So I heard verbatim that quite a bit. And that it taught me a few powerful things. It taught me that, first of all, it's that sort of culture that I want to work on. I want to change, because so often, that idea of, who's probably been sexually abused?
Yes.
Nebach, them, the ones who can't really cut it, and who are struggling through life. And we say, oi, have Rahmanis on them. You have no idea what they've been through. We use it as an excuse, and we're so used to kind of casting it onto the most marginalized in society. And so for me, changing that culture has been something which I'm very dedicated to. But beyond that, it's shown me that everyone's going through something. Everyone's going through something, and usually the less that you expect someone is going through, the more internal and the more stuck they are with that issue. And it's taught me to approach people differently. It's taught me to view people differently. It's taught me to relate to people differently, to be there for people in a different way. And it's really made me, I'd like to feel more understanding, more loving, more having the ability to just be there for people, being aware of the fact that everyone is really carrying their own peckle through life. And the more you're aware of that, the more you adapt your conduct accordingly.
Right. It's very interesting that the Hebrew word for feelings, regesh, when rearranged, spell the Hebrew word gesher, which is a bridge. And it's a fascinating concept that, according to the Kabbalists, the gift of feelings are not just there to heighten or enrich or enhance our emotive life, but they're actually given to us as that bridge, as that means to reach across and meet others going through things on the so-called other side. Let me jump into something. You described the feelings you had when your nanny, your abuser, was finally charged as the most healing thing you could have done. But you said, if I'm going to acknowledge that something terrible has been done to me, what kind of God lets that happen? What makes your story, I think, unique is that you're a rabbi. You were raised in a rabbinic home and household, very dedicated to faith, to religion, to tradition, and you're passionate about that. And I have to say, Avremi, there are a number of individuals who I know who have been abused sexually, horrifically, who started off their lives in a religious home environment and community setting, but this type of abuse completely derailed their religious life. They completely disconnected from their religious life, either because they felt they were let down, they were betrayed by their religious community, whichever one it may be, or by God himself. And so I wonder if you could share a few words about two aspects, both before your awareness, when you described earlier that utter, complete, impossible tension, and then thereafter when you came to realize you were actually a victim and how you managed to square that with your belief system.
I'd love to, and I appreciate that, because for me it's something so pivotal. But before I do, I would point that out. What's unfortunate for me, deeply unfortunate, is that I know that some people have used my experience to kind of promote the idea of, well, if he did it and stayed in the fold, there's no reason why anybody should have left the fold. Right. And you know, I take great pain when I hear that. You know, I will be the first to tell you that it's impossible to compare any two people's experience in this arena. In general, you should never be comparing people's experience, but certainly not in this field. And I know that there are people out there with you know, legitimate issues. You know, there are people that have been beyond the abuse that they've suffered, that have been horribly let down by their communities, and that is a sad reality of the world we live in. I feel like ignorance is rampant on this topic, and that's a conversation for another question. But there are so many out there that are, you know, that are hurt and struggling and are really, you know, out there in the cold, all alone by themselves. And we must do better as a community to reach out to those and to reestablish those connections. For me personally, I often tell people, you mentioned a two-pronged relationship. I tell people that God and I have a very complicated relationship, and I actually kind of put it in three phases. I think a lot of people nowadays, when hearing an Orthodox rabbi talk about, you know, their experiences, I think some people on a basic level expect the answer to go something like, "Oh, it's all good," you know, "Oh yes, me and God have just been so tight through all of this, and it's been my unwavering faith that has, you know, allowed me to." No, not remotely. Because I wasn't aware of the terminology and the vernacular to know that what I was experiencing was abuse. Well, if it's not abuse, then what is it? And in my mind, what it was as a child was extremely immoral behavior. And if I'm part of this extremely immoral behavior, then I was pretty convinced that God hated me. And I know that sounds very simplistic, but this was a theory developed by an 8-year-old. And it's an 8-year-old's theory that, you know, if I'm doing the wrong thing, then God probably and legitimately hates me. And I went through life for a very long time thinking that God hated me, justifiably so. We had a very strained relationship as such. Once I started therapy and I began to understand the dynamics of abuse, and what had happened to me was not with my consent, I'm unable to consent, I'm a child, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I realized that there's a lonelier place than thinking that God hates you. And that is that thinking that God has ignored you. If I believe that God hated me, at least I was partially to blame for that. It's not such an overwhelming reality because it's your fault. You can't be upset about it because these are all because of your choices and your actions. When you come to understand that you have been on the receiving end of such evil, and that's it. So, okay, so did God miss my file? Did it not get across his desk? Like, how? And this went on for 10 years, mind you. You know, God missed it once or twice or a couple months worth. Okay, he's a busy guy up there, but where have you been? Where did you go in the middle of all this? And you know, I think specifically as a rabbi and as a chassid, you know, someone who learns Jewish mysticism, and you know, and Jewish mysticism, we spend all day talking about God's all-knowing, all-being, all-seeing, all-powerful, and it's that God that somehow, I don't know, just sat out all of my experiences. And what I'm fortunate for is that I got to a better place, and that place was a place of understanding why all this had to happen to me. And I think that happened specifically by finding some sort of mission and purpose in my own experiences, to be there to be able to help others. That was healing for me. And ultimately, I will never know why that healing had to come about through adversity. You know, why couldn't I have brought light into this world through more positive circumstances? And that's a question which I'll never have an answer to. And I will proudly join the legions of the millions and billions around this world who have to engage in pain and suffering in a certain sense. But being able to find that purpose and being able to see tangibly how my experiences could make other people's journeys easier, finding that purpose, finding that connection with God, that was really the most healing thing that could have happened.
Wow. So it's really when you decided to do something about that pain and go public that the issue with God somehow resolved itself almost instantaneously, because you saw that pain as propelling you forward and transforming it into awareness, education, and purpose.
Sure. I mean, I would hesitate to say resolved. You know, God and I still have slightly tenuous conversations from time to time, you know, about the state of affairs of certain issues. But yes, it definitely gives you a prism into why you are involved in certain things.
That's an incredibly powerful point. It's a very, very, and it also sheds light on so many millions, and as you said, billions, who have not yet come to any form of purpose in their journey. And for them, that pain is excruciating, because not only have they suffered personally, emotionally, psychologically, but to feel alienated by God must be the epitome of loneliness. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's quite powerful for all of us watching to take with us when we walk the streets of life, either suffering from or trying to assist others who are suffering from that early phase of pain before they've reached any type of, personal epiphany, paradigm shift, etc. Can I ask you something, Avremi, personal? Do you suffer still in real time, real terms from what happened regularly? Does it throw you off? And then when it does, what do you do about that? You have to remind yourself about this mission.
Sure.
What I hate to put it this way, and if you're not comfortable, but what are the difficult times like for you? Because you're presenting such an incredibly positive and powerful talk and message, and I don't know that people ask you this regularly. But what are the difficult mornings or evenings like? What sets you back?
One of the most important things that I did in therapy very early on in the beginning, my therapist gave me a book to read. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk from the Harvard School of Medicine, which is right now recognized as one of the leading global authorities on trauma. And the premise of the book is a simple one. Trauma survivors suffer physically from the experiences they went through. He goes into great. You can see, the literal the rewiring of the brain and the changing of the way the entire system processes certain experiences. But for me, that was pivotal. For me, it was pivotal if I was really going to try and get a grasp and a handle on what I struggled with, to realize the extent of it. And that is that the experiences that I went through, the trauma that I went through, don't just bother me in sexually based situations. I think it's the biggest misunderstanding about sexual violence. If you're going to be celibate, you'll be fine, and it's no big deal. It probably bothers you from time to time when engaging in such activity. Oscar Wilde once famously said that everything in the world is about sex, with the exception of sex, which is about power. When a child has that power taken from them at a young age, has that trust taken from them at a young age, has those boundaries ripped apart at a young age, experiences loneliness at such a young age, every dynamic that they enter, every relationship that they enter, every conversation that they are a part of, every encounter that they are part of, I tend to process that differently than most other human beings. It's the way that we have become rewired. We deal with certain experiences differently than most, quote, normal people. And for me, that was crucial to realize. I tell the story. I had a leg injury a couple months ago, right in the beginning of COVID. And so for a little while, I was functional. I was moving around, but I had this huge brace on my leg. And a couple months ago, I was in the parking lot of our local grocery store, and I'm pushing a shopping cart, and I had this huge brace on my leg. And someone could see that I was struggling to get to my car. It was a painful day. And they come over and they say, "Sir, I see that you're in such pain. Let me help you. Where's your car? Let me help you unload your groceries. You look like you're suffering." And I thanked the kind gentleman, and it was beautiful. And when I got in the car, I thought to myself, my goodness, if only emotional scars would be as manifest as physical scars. Because when we see someone limping through a parking lot, what kind of cold-hearted fellow doesn't run over and says, "Oh, please, oy, Nebuch, look at you, poor guy, let me help you out." But what we don't see is people who have so much emotional scarring in certain situations where they're limping, they're emotionally limping, and we're oblivious to it. And we don't know that they need help, how to help them. And so for me, I relate to that very deeply. And I realize the profound impact that my experiences have left on me. And again, it's colored the way I look at life. It's colored the way I look at that sort of dynamic.
Wow. It strikes me then that also part of your message to people going through pain is perhaps to share that with someone who they trust, who can help them like that fellow helped you. In other words, part of the educational process, I think, is that we aren't all alone. You described what it felt like to think you were literally the only one. And part of what motivated you to go out there was to become that face for others. And I think that educational process is essential. We all have those issues where we feel like perhaps I'm the only one going through this. Or even if not, I can't ever share that with someone or with my friends. What will they think about me? Or how will they react? Or will they, from this point onward, classify me differently than to the way they did? And I think your story, especially because of how, I think, exuberant and confident you were throughout, as I mentioned, when you were with us in London, I think tells a different story, a very essential story. Avremi, another question. What do you think people most misunderstand about the concept of childhood trauma, that if you could set the record straight, you would?
That it's a health issue. And I think this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. This is, I have the good fortune of working with some incredible, incredible young men and women within the Chabad community. And a lot of these people are struggling to share with their parents, teachers, whomever it is, the extent of their experiences. And I think that the biggest issue that we bump up against is the ignorance surrounding the topic. I'm dealing with a young woman who's of marriageable age. Her parents want her to enter shidduchim. She went through a horrible, horrible process, and she's 22, and her parents really want her to get out there. And she's been seeing a therapist, sort of, and her mother said to her, "When can you just start feeling better?" As if survivors of sexual violence wake up in the morning and decide which hat to put on that day. Should I feel sad or should I feel happy? And all I must do to feel happy is just put on the right hat and I'll feel better. And it's a health issue. It's a medical issue. It requires medical guidance. This is not a case of people who are sad. This is, people who have gone through terrible, terrible pain and suffering on a real complex level. And as such, require solutions to deal with that, to cope with that. And it's what's most empowering to know is that those solutions are out there. Those solutions are so readily available in our community, outside our community, for whatever slice of life someone comes from. There are readily available solutions and help, and there's things that can be done. But one must take the bull by the horns and embrace that and be prepared for that journey and realize the burden of healing that is ahead. And I think when one is open to that, one really embraces that. But that reality check is so, so crucial.
Well, Avremi, it strikes me that you have garnered a tremendous amount of, obviously, personal introspective wisdom, but also wisdom that comes through talking to so many. I wonder whether perhaps you've considered writing a book about your experiences, but moreover, really serving as a manual of sorts within the human narrative and experience that you went through, of precisely what you're sharing right now, the various different crucial ingredients to healing. A section of it could be directed at parents of children, a section of children or siblings, friends. There are so many dimensions to this. And it's unfortunate that despite the Me Too movement, which of course was a wonderful dismantling of a facade or a cloak of secrecy and silence, there remains, as we well know, I'm hearing from you and you know better than anyone, rampant ignorance, and still there is a culture of silence. Alternatively, some type of the short, clips on YouTube that you can share questions and answers. Far be it from me to advise you, Avremi, on your work. I'm sure you have so much on, but it strikes me that this is the type of thing that needs to get out there, and that you have a very special and unique way of teaching and sharing.
I appreciate that, and I love the fact that you brought up the Me Too movement, because I think that the Me Too movement, which did some incredible things, and I have no shame in saying that a large part of my decisions to come forward were impacted by the Me Too movement and the shift in narrative, but I think there's one gross misunderstanding about the Me Too movement, and that is that, the Me Too movement was roughly 2016, 2017, and I think there's this misunderstood concept that around 2016, 2017, there had been a large escalation in the episodes of sexual violence, which precipitated this decision to speak about it. I think that's woefully inaccurate. the disclosures that were coming out through the Me Too movement were 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. And I think what happened as a society is that we all decided to view survivors differently. And I think that is a societal change, which is, it's a drip movement, as we call it. It really is one by one, and it really is, on a person by person and family by family basis. And, one of the incredible experiences that I went through my disclosure is, I think that it shook up a lot of people as to how close to home these issues hit. And I'll often have that conversation with people, and people will call me up and say, "Oh, I saw your story. It's so inspiring. Thank you for doing it." And I'll say, "Thank you very much, but I got to ask you a question. What would happen if your child came out about it?" It's marvelous to talk about and to look at and to analyze and to have all these great things said about them in someone else's family. And as we say in English, in yenas, that it's great to have that distance. Are you ready to have that conversation with your child today? Tomorrow, if they were to come forward about something that was going on in their life? And if the answer to that question is no, not really, thank you for your compliments, thank you for your feedback, but we need you as part of the solution. And all of the great things that you have to say and all of the kind, platitudes that you've shared are wonderful, but this is close to home, and we all need to be aware of that.
That's a very, very critical point. What you're saying is that even your story, which was closer to home for many than beforehand, suffers the risk of being perceived as someone else's story.
Sure.
And the whole purpose of you telling a story was to create awareness so that people are more vigilant within their own, neighborhood or their own family unit or setting. Wow. So that is a very important point, Avremi.
Actually, with that, I want to revisit something you had mentioned earlier, only because I feel it's a crucial question. I want to make sure it gets addressed. You had mentioned about my own being a child, my own being a parent at this point. I come to this issue now from the other side of the fence. I have two boys of my own, and they're growing up much quicker than I can imagine. And so oftentimes, and as you mentioned, we have caretakers at home. And oftentimes the question that I'll get is, what do you do as a parent? So, you've been through this, you made it through to the other side. Now what? How can we make sure that this doesn't happen in our own families? And so I often share the anecdote. Shortly before I came forward publicly, I realized, there were a lot of people I didn't want them to find out about this from the internet. So there were some family members and close friends I wanted to tell directly. So I called a cousin of mine who's a Chabad rabbi on a college campus here in the US, and we're quite close. And I called him up and I told him the information over the phone. We spoke for a few minutes, and you could hear his mind was in a million places, and he hangs up and he calls me back about 15 minutes later, and he says, "I just want to let you know, I talked to my wife. We spoke about your experiences. We are just so horrified about what you went through with your babysitter. As a result of that, just in solidarity with you, to share with you how shook up we are. We have a number of caretakers here around the house, people who care for our children while we're out doing, Chabad, Rabbi, and Rabbits and things. And my wife and I called all of them, sight unseen. We fired them all. Just got rid of all of them. The lot of them, just gone, finished." And I laughed. I thought it was very sweet, but clearly that's not the way to go about this. And so, people will often ask, and they'll word it in this way, given your experiences, what can we do to guarantee that our children will not go through these sorts of experiences? And I'll say, as parents, there's one thing that you can do to guarantee that your children will never cross paths with someone who seeks to do them harm. You guys are in a lockdown now. It's actually easier. You can wrap them in bubble wrap and lock them in a closet in your home. That is about the only thing that you can do if you want to absolutely guarantee they will never cross paths with someone who seeks to do them harm. Short of that, come on. We live in a world where this is the sort of behavior that is practiced by babysitters and sports coaches and rabbis and pastors and preachers and total strangers and the people at the supermarket, and the list goes on and on. So what are you going to do? You can't cut off your children from exposure to the outside world. What you can do is create an environment where your children feel that in your home, in your setting, in your environment, they have the ability and the freedom to discuss any topic with you as a parent. And even the sort of topic that they might feel that by bringing up this topic, they might incriminate themselves in some way. They might bring themselves in a negative light as a result of their perception of the situation. There will never, ever be judgment or condescension from you as a parent for your children. That is the only thing we can do, by changing that conversation, by educating our children as to the realities of the world around them and the freedom, giving them the freedom to discuss any and every topic openly with us. That is how we really move the needle.
Wow, it's very important. That's a very, very important message, and it's probably easier said than done, Avremi, in terms of.
It's most certainly easier said than done.
Because let's even, if I can turn the question to you, I don't know your parents very well, but I do know them. I know your dad. He's such an incredibly warm and loving guy, and I know that he has dedicated his life to helping so many young people going through crisis and challenge and dysfunction. He's a legend in that respect. So it's not as if he's not attuned in any way, shape, or form. To the contrary, I'd say he's more attuned than most. But that point, but parents will be parents in the sense that they're balancing unconditional love with raising children. So to communicate somewhere in between the love and the discipline, that no matter what happens, even if you feel, and I think that's a critical point, personally culpable or immoral, sheer nonetheless, because you will have no judgment, that's something that's easier said than done, as essential as it is. And that's why I'm very happy you raised that. But I think it's fair to elaborate maybe a drop on that. If you
sure.
can.
So my parents, I never expressed the sentiment that that if I would have discussed such a topic, there would be misunderstanding. Frankly, I'm a child of the 90s, and when I was growing up, this was not talked about, period. This was not a Chabad issue, or this was not widely talked about. And I always share the following point. I grew up here in Salt Lake City, as I mentioned, no school, not a whole lot of exposure to the outside world, as it were, and our token time out in the larger world was summer camp. Every year we'd go for 2 months in the Catskill Mountains, and we'd see other kids our age and have those social opportunities. And every single year, as my parents took us to the airport for the flight back east, we would have the exact same conversation. If in camp there's going to be an adult who is going to harm you, who's going to hit you, who's going to threaten to hit you, who is going to make you feel, dangerous in any way, or is going to threaten you with harm, you need not be afraid of protecting that adult. Get to a payphone, call us up, and Tati will fly out to camp and punch the guy in the face, because your Tati is the strongest person in the world, as every child believes. Great. So I go off to camp armed with this information. And so indeed, if one night in camp, a counselor takes me outside the bunkhouse onto the front porch and would hypothetically slap me across the face and would say to me, "You better not tell anybody, because if you do, I will do it again and again and again and again. Every time you speak out about it, every time you mention this, there will be another slap." When I go back into the bunkhouse, good news, I know exactly what to do. I know not to be afraid of him. I know not to be susceptible to his threats. I will get myself to a payphone the next morning and call home, and my father will fly down to camp and rescue me from this person whose secret I was keeping. But let me turn the situation a little bit. What would happen if the counselor would take me out onto the bunkhouse porch and give me a $100 bill and say, "Hey, this is for you. It's a lot of money for a little boy. It's a lot of money for anybody. You can hang on to this money, provided you don't tell anybody where it comes from. If by the end of the week you haven't told anybody where the money comes from, I will give you another $100 bill," and so on and so forth, so long as you keep this between the two of us. In English, we call that behavior grooming, because what that adult is doing is putting distance between the child and his support systems. Because at that point, if I were to tell anybody about the $100 bill, they're not losing out. I'm losing out. The counselor's not going to get in trouble. I'm going to be $100 out of pocket. How much ice cream could I have bought in camp with $100? What we as parents need to do is to create that environment where we tell the child, no, even in that instance, you should bring it up. Even if you feel like you're going to lose out in a certain sense, you're going to have to give back the $100, you're going to feel like something happened to you, that's where you speak up, because that is the beginning of creating that breach of trust between the child and their support system. And that's where we educate children.
Yeah, and that's really a powerful point, because as you said before, 90% of abusers are typically embedded in a family, or they're part of their safe space, right? And so you don't want to go to the other extreme. So like you mentioned that anecdote, and basically children walk around afraid of family, and at the same time they have to be aware. So what would you tell parents how to strike that balance in a concrete way? By the way, are there books that discuss this. What is what are some of the concrete tools that parents can take home with them?
There are a number of good ones, but I think the key point is, I'll put it to you this way. In therapy, when discussing my experiences, there was no chronological order that I had to put them into. We kind of talked about things as they came up. When going to law enforcement, they needed a script. And so before I went for my initial in-person interview with the police, I had kind of tried to marshal my thoughts as, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened as I remembered them. I was caught completely off guard when the detective who had been trained in sex crimes started the conversation completely differently. And he wanted me to back up about 2 years before anything started. And he wanted to hear about the grooming techniques. He wanted to hear about the slow infiltration into breaking down a child's cycle of trust. And especially in an environment where there are so many topics that are so highly charged and so taboo, how that came to be, because that really gave him the context of whether these charges were legitimate or not, if my abuser had displayed the signs of a classic predator who engages, in those sorts of behaviors. So I think the tools that we need to give our children, that we must give our children, and I'm happy to provide afterwards, there's some great list of books online, is always remembering the circle of trust they have, never being pulled away from that, never ever feeling that there's a crack in that mentality, because that crack starts very, very, very small. And as any predator knows, it's that crack that slowly gets built upon, and that crack begins to splinter and grow. And that's what allows this sort of behavior to flourish. And as parents, it's about reinforcing that circle of trust, encouraging our children to feel comfortable, to be open with us, to fess up about the small things. Having gone through my experiences, I encourage my children to practice total honesty. If you're the one who colored on the wall, own up to that. There will be no punishment coming. There will be no recriminations. We may confiscate the crayons for a little bit because, we don't want that to continue, but comfort, honesty, trust. There's never judgment coming, because it's those cracks that develop.
That's great advice, but I could see that being a challenge also in the sense of consequences. But let's leave that. I'm sure there's many, as you said, there's a reading list that can probably break it down in greater detail. If you could talk, Avremi, to the 8-year-old you who was being abused, what would you tell him?
I would tell him that I'm going to fight for him. That 8-year-old, at a very young age, began a very, very lonely path. And it's been well documented, and it's something which is talked about in these circles very, very often, that survivors of childhood trauma, specifically of sexual abuse, are the loneliest creatures in the world, because they experience that isolation, and they experience that just being on an island by themselves from an age when a child should never ever have to experience that. And for the duration of their lives, all they want is that little slice of them of oneself that stays with you after you go through these experiences, for someone to reach out and put your arm around that boy's shoulders and say, I'm going to fight for you. I know this wasn't your fault. I know that you spent a lot of time blaming that 8-year-old for the depth of the experiences that they have gone through, and I'm going to fight for you. I'm now educated to the extent of what actually has happened and what that is all about, and I'm going to keep on fighting for you, because you have felt for a very long time that no one was fighting for you, you least of all, and I will be there for you.
And what message would you like to give to other survivors?
I was quoted in the video. There were many a night before I would go to bed and look in the mirror and kind of, have that momentary reflection, that one does while they're brushing their teeth before bed. And I would think to myself that the person looking back at me, if anybody in the world were to know the extent of my experiences, would consider that person the most loathsome creature in the world, because of the extent of what they have gone through. And what happened as a result of my coming forward is that I found that there was one more person in the world that understood me, that loved me and respected me and valued me for who I am. And from 1, that grew to 2, and ultimately that grew to 4, and then 16, and so forth. And so if there was one survivor out there who was watching this, who felt that isolation, who felt like they were in silence, who felt like there was no one in the world that might understand them, and they really are going through that, I would like you to know that there's one more person out there who understands you. I get you for what you're going through. And I think that you have within you the courage to find a world where that number can continue to increase. And there's another person that understands you and another person that understands you, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. And that is really how we bring back people from these sorts of experiences.
That's very powerful. And I imagine that you're happy for people to reach out to you as and when on a personal basis, if they could gain further insight. I know someone asked you a question about what's the name of the author of the book, The Body Keeps the Score?
Sure, it's Bessel, Bessel, Van der Kolk, Kolk. To that end, one of the things that I did when I came forward is I have a separate email address, not on my Chabad server, totally confidential. It's avremistory@gmail.com, AVREMISSTORY. I can put it in the comments on the Facebook feed. And if people want to reach out and continue the conversation in private, I would be more than honored to do so.
Avremi, the hour's late, but if it's okay, I'm going to ask you another one or two questions before we wrap.
We're here. The hour is very early, Rabbi Collinson.
Studies show that that sexual predators were often abused themselves as children, who continue this utterly inexcusable cycle of abuse on others. From your perspective, how would you encourage those who have been abused to break the cycle of pain?
I think that reality, the percentage of people who go on to become offenders themselves, should be the greatest call to action for survivors of these sorts of crimes to get the help that they so desperately need. Because I think that what that cycle shows us is that you have these people who, in most instances, and this does not excuse their inactions in any way, shape, or form, but many of them who have been through these experiences themselves and find themselves in a world of so much pain and hurt that they spend so much of their time looking for things to reclaim themselves, to numb the pain that they feel so intensely. And many of them turn to harmful substances, whether it be drugs and alcohol or other sorts of negative and dangerous behaviors. And when that doesn't work, sadly, for so many people, the only way to reclaim that power taken from them at such a young age is to continue that cycle of violence, is to take that power from another young, innocent, unsuspecting child. And so for me, when I learn of those realities, to me, it's the greatest wake-up call for people who are in pain to get help before they become the next link in this chain of violence. You can absolutely be the one to break the cycle by taking the steps that your abuser chose not to for whatever reason, and you can be the one to make sure that the buck does end with you. You stop the cycle, you get the pain, and you learn how to move on.
That's powerful. Thank you for sharing. Two more questions. One question, this is a very practical and concrete question. What is currently being done and what more can be done to fight this horrific phenomena of child abuse?
This is a war of education. This is, and I mentioned earlier, and I don't use the term war lightly, but I mentioned earlier, and this has been seen so many times in society, issues like these, sexual abuse in communities, never ever exists in a vacuum. There has got to be something, a culture, a cover-up, a person that is allowing these sorts of situations to happen. Thankfully, what is slowly happening is a war of education, of people who want to learn, who want to know, who want to understand the intense ramifications of these sorts of issues. One of the most profound conversations that I had on this topic was an overly simplistic one. I'm very fortunate here in town. There's a tremendous workforce put together by the governor's office of faith leaders to tackle a number of systemic issues, and one of them is child safety. And so I serve on this work group with a number of other non-Jewish faith leaders here in town. And several months ago, I gave a talk to them, these are my colleagues, describing my experiences. And I felt like the talk went well. You know, it was received, it was heard. And there was a gentleman in the group, a younger guy, actually close to my age, and I noticed he was really shook up by the content of the talk. And so I went over to him afterwards and I put an arm around him. I said, "Tim, are you okay?" And he looks at me and he says, "Rabbi, this is for real. This is for real." And, you know, I've gotten a lot of very eloquent comments as a result of my talks. But for me, the simple nature of what he was trying to share really spoke to something hitting home. People are realizing this is for real. Communal leaders are realizing this is for real. There are people in their community who have been affected by this, and they're coming around to realize the extensive damage caused by these issues and what we need to do better as communal leaders to educate ourselves on a regular basis, to hear the voices of those that have been harmed and learn how we can better care for them. And I think, like I said, this is absolutely a process of education. And for, if one is a communal leader and does not feel like they are in a position to speak authoritatively on the topic with enough information to make the right calls, find out, ask, learn, study, engage, find out from other voices around you who have been through this, the extent of these issues, because there are far too many instances, and one is more than enough, and there's far more than one instances of communal leaders who have brushed this under the rug, who have not understood the complexity of it, and as a result of that have done away with it, not seeking to cause anybody harm, but not really understanding the extent of the issue. And that is really where the work lies. Educate, educate, educate.
Have you reached out? Again, it's a personal question. Have you reached out, or do you make a point of reaching out to leaders of communities that have issues with cover-up and cultures of silence?
I try to. I deeply try to. I know that the Jewish community is no stranger to this issue. My community is no stranger to this issue. Like I said, I don't think there's a community in the world that is a stranger to this issue. And perhaps I'm a little too naive on the topic, that I believe that the people involved are not coming from a position of wantonly wanting to harm children. I do believe it's a culture of ignorance. And all you can do to fight a culture of ignorance is not to burn it down, but is to try to build it back up from a more educated place. And I'm thankful for some of the progress that we've made. And I know that there's an endless amount of progress that needs to be made. And sadly, all of those issues that are born of ignorance nonetheless leave behind human bodies. They leave behind people who have been harmed irreparably, and all we can do as a community is really, really pledge to arm our leaders with knowledge, to educate and empower and inform and really heal and move on together as a community.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely essential that a curriculum is created, or at least it is implemented across schools, across rabbinic programs, across systems, any type of system that is raising people who are in a potential position of child care and leadership. And I think those are the concrete steps that we need to work towards to ensure that this war on education succeeds. Avremi, let me conclude with one question, a personal question. How have you been changed by this experience? Is there something, a message, an insight that you would share with us that can somehow convey, when you look back on that terrible, terrible decade, you look back on it not only seeing the horrific wreckage, but also the birthing grounds, as it were, for growth and for progress?
I think for me, most of all, what it has taught me is that if you really want to be part of God's plan in this world, allow yourself to be susceptible for him to show you what he has in mind for you. From a very young age, I had my life's mission in mind, and I wanted to make an impact in the world. And I was going to be a Chabad rabbi and do all the incredible things that Chabad rabbis do, and it's all going to be nice and fine. And that's how I was going to make an impact. And even up until 2 years ago, not too long ago, I never imagined that this would become something that people would know, and I certainly did not see this becoming my area of influence in the world. And I consider this something which I was inspired by the Rebbe's teachings, by Chassidus and Jewish philosophy. I had the opportunity to realize that oftentimes, if we really want to make an impact in this world, allow the Almighty God to be the one to show us the area of impact that he has for us, because oftentimes it's an arena that we never expected, and oftentimes it's that arena that God has prepared for us that allow us to make an impact far more dramatically than anything we could have ever imagined. For me, there's one teaching, there's one thought that keeps me going, especially I think about it now as we're gearing up for Purim in the not too distant future. I often think about the Rebbe is teaching on the exchange between Mordechai and Esther, and right in the meat and potatoes of the story, when Esther finds out that Mordechai is sitting in the center of town in sackcloth and ashes, and she freaks out what's going on, and he says to her, there's been this decree, you must go to the king, and there's this very interesting dialogue between the two of them, which doesn't seem to be connected, in which Mordechai says to Esther, you must go to the king, and Esther says, I can't. It doesn't just work like that I just stroll into the king. It might be the end of my life. It's too dangerous. And what we find is that Mordechai does not try to talk her down from her perception of how dangerous the situation is. Mordechai tells her something else entirely. And Mordechai says, the Jews will find a way out of the situation. What you need to think to yourself for a moment is the reason you are placed in this situation is because you are so uniquely empowered to make an impact in a way that nobody else can. I agree with you. I'm not going to argue with you. It is mortally terrifying. It is dangerous. You're 100% right in your assessment of the danger. What you need to ask yourself is, why are you the one to be in that situation? And I think about that for myself. When I thought about coming forward, I was terrified. I was terrified of what that might mean for me and for my family and how we would be perceived. And no one told me that I was wrong for being terrified. No one talked me down from that level of terror. But what was shared with me and what I was able to think about is, what if the reason that you're the one considering this is because you were uniquely placed in the situation? And for me, it's what I think as human beings, as Jews, but really as God's creatures on this earth, is what we should think about is, if we find ourselves in a tough spot, after doing the sufficient woe is me, think to ourselves that perhaps the reason we specifically were placed in this tough spot is because of the unique abilities that we have to make a difference in this particular arena like nobody else does.
Wow, what a powerful message. It's one thing to hear that. It's one thing to give that as a sermon. It's quite another to embody that teaching through life choices that have really set you on a course that you didn't anticipate. Avremi, thank you so much for your honesty, for your insight, for your humanity, for your spirituality, for your empathy, and for, I hope, your very concrete message. First and foremost, education. We need to be educated. We need to be much, much more understanding and aware of the issues so that we could support survivors far better than they are supported, that we can welcome them and alleviate that pain of loneliness, of depression and self-loathing. And we need to be educated as parents and educators, as rabbis and leaders as well, to put in, of course, the essential safeguards that are necessary. We also need to understand that for whatever awareness is out there, it pales in comparison to the amount of work that has yet still to be done. So let us each become agents, ambassadors for this issue into our own social circles of influence and responsibility and impact. And finally, your final message, I think, is something that resonates with everyone on this conversation, regardless of the challenges that they experience, regardless of the curveballs they were thrown and the setbacks they encounter. The question that we ask ourselves, according to Hasidic thinking, is not why me, but what can I do? How can I utilize that circumstantial location to transform my challenge or pain into purpose?
I would just add one anecdote, Rabbi Mendel. I'm sorry to cut you off, but the way I like to think about it is, when finding ourselves in a tough situation, instead of asking ourselves, why me, with the emphasis being on the why, I like to focus on the me. Why, but why me? Why am I in this given situation? And what could I do to change that up?
Wow. Thank you, Rabbi Zippel. And let me just speak on behalf of everyone on tonight's conversation. We want to bless you to have continued energy, strength, and courage to address these issues openly, courageously, and bring ever greater awareness to this particular illness and, in a sense, cancer. And hopefully, please God, we yearn for the time that this issue, among all issues of challenge, pain, and suffering, are a thing of the past. As the prophets teach us, will one day occur, hopefully speedily in our day, with the coming of the ushering in of a different era of wholesomeness, of healing, of awareness, and of divine goodness and godliness. Thank you for all that you do, and may Hashem bless you in the way that you bring so much blessing to others.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Friends, join us for next week's session with the internet's famous and most popular rabbi, Rabbi Manis Friedman. Where do we go from here? Inspiration and insights on how to navigate the difficult times and new normal we are facing with Rabbi Manis Friedman, 19th of January at 8 o'clock. Looking forward to welcome you, dear friends, next week in good health and prosperity, serenity, and peace of mind.